Hi, I'm Matt Turner. I need to stress that I'm here in a personal capacity with no affiliations. I also don't work in cloud native anymore, so I'm not going to talk about computers either. They asked me to do this talk, and I said, "What about?" And they said, "You? You're Scottish, right? Talk about that." Do I sound Scottish? Who here is Scottish? About half of you is okay, and who is English? Nobody's admitting to that. All right, safest way.
Yeah. Welsh.
Lewis is Welsh, everybody. Lewis, the double-barreled English surname. Yeah, right. So I guess so. You're here. You might be. There's electricity, which you probably weren't expecting, but you are in Edinburgh. If we zoom out a bit, this is the central belt of Scotland. It's called the M8 corridor, and this is where like 78% of people actually live. This kind of all of Scotland, in case there's any Americans thought it was Iran, but this is all of Scotland. I'm not going to talk about that though, because if we go to England, we go to Northamptonshire, we find a little place called Corby. So what's this got to do with Scotland? It doesn't have anything to do with computers, but what's it got to do with anything? So in the 18th, it's a bit of a history lesson. So in the 18th century, in the 1700s, Glasgow was doing very well. You've got this river, the Clyde, that is wide and deep and runs right into the center, and then exits out west into the Atlantic, pointing directly at the newly discovered Americas. And there was a lot of trade, transatlantic and otherwise, and it was tobacco that brought in the majority of the money, but cotton and sugar played a part as well. I do have to mention there was direct involvement in the slave trade. I don't want to paint this as an entirely rosy, light-hearted picture. That does need to be acknowledged. But all of this made Glasgow very rich, very important. It was known as the second city of the British Empire. And some individual people got very wealthy from all of this as well. And most of them actually put a lot of money back into the city. So if you've not been, there's a grand centre. There's lots of fancy churches, obviously. There's a great uni. There's art galleries. You know, the older bits are really not what a lot of people expect. And it was culturally and scientifically very important as well. James Watt, Lord Kelvin, although he was Irish, was a professor at Glasgow. Joseph Black, who invented carbon dioxide, or did he discover it? Right. He was at Glasgow, and then some sociologist called Adam Smith, who Edinburgh's made a statue of him up on the Royal Mile, but he was a professor at Scotland, at Glasgow. And to support this trade, there was a bunch of shipbuilding. As I say, the Clyde is wide and deep. You can build ships right in the middle of town. And there's iron ore. So iron and steel production have always been around. And the Glaswegian shipbuilding industry switched very early from wooden ships to iron and steel ships. So this was all great, right? Up into and including World War II, there was a lot of demand for Glasgow's industries. Obviously in the war, you know, lots of heavy industry, weapons manufacture, and shipbuilding. But after the war, things started to go a bit wrong. There was cheap international competition, not least from sort of resurgent Japan, that hit the ship and the train building, and then containerized freight, no pun intended, killed a lot of the manual work that was available down at the docks. So things got pretty bad economically, and the city was also kind of crumbling. For each of those fancy churches that was built, there was a lot of sort of tenement and poor housing that had been put up in a rush a century before there was any sort of standards or regulation around that, and that's where a lot of people lived. So this led to the so-called Glasgow slum clearances, where they demolished all of these tenants and all the other shite housing and relocated people. There were two competing plans for how to do this. One was by a guy called Robert Bruce, the Bruce Report. He was a Glaswegian. And the other was the Clydesdale Valley Regional Plan by an Englishman named Sir Patrick Abercrombie. I will let you guess which one of these people was the English knight. Now, they actually both agreed on demolishing the city centre, the slums, so that happened. What they disagreed on was where to relocate those people to. And in the end, both of their plans actually ended up getting followed. Bruce, who is the man on your left, wanted to keep them in Glasgow. So hence the building of a load of high-rise estates, schemes, we call them, St Pollock, Dunchapel, Easterhouse. But Abercrombie was your Newtown guy. He was the guy who gave us Welwyn Garden City, Milton Keynes. And he advocated for overspill, which meant taking a bunch of people and moving them out of Glasgow into these new towns that he proposed building as part of his plan. So we got East Kilbride, we got Cumbernauld, where the taxman writes to you from, and we got Corby. Now it's worth saying that this was meant to fix things, right? This was the bright future. People were trying to help it. I'm going to talk about how it didn't exactly work out in Corby, and obviously Easterhouse is infamous too. But they had Le Corbusier designed a bunch of this stuff. It really was like the best and brightest kind of pushing this stuff forwards. So Corby. Iron ore had been known around there for thousands of years. There's a village just down the road called Rothwell, which gets its name from Rödewell. My pronunciation, however bad, if there's any Scandinavians in the room, is better than Lewis's, so we're good. Which is Norse for red well, because the water would come out of the ground red from the sheer amount of iron ore. I'm going to have to skip some stuff to stay on time, but then it was a small industry, it was mostly manual, but then from the sort of 1800s on. But in April 1950, Corby was designated as one of these new towns. Loads of housing was built, and a load of people moved down in the 50s and 60s, a lot of them from the Glasgow slum clearances. So by 1970, the population was 50,000 people, and it was 1,500 at the turn of the century. I also can't overstate, because I don't imagine any of you have been there, the size of the steelworks, like the sheer scale of 680 acres I've got written down, the largest in Western Europe. Like, it apparently managers used to ride around on bikes to get to all their meetings. So what does that get you? Well, I went back a couple of months ago. This is just some guy's house. But there's iron brew and there's tenants in the shops. There's cafes that do square sausage and tatty scones. It's on the Highland Games circuit. It's the only place that goes south of the border. Corby is nicknamed Little Scotland. There's third and fourth generation people with Glaswegian accents. It's actually diverged a bit and is now known as the Corby accent. And it's like somebody at UPenn wrote a paper about it. This is a Church of Scotland building. It's very ugly, but there you go. This is actually a pub, not a hill walking society. It's very flat. And, well, there's even nominative determinism. However, in 1967, the steel industry, so the works were actually privately owned by a Glaswegian company called Stewart and Lloyd's. The steel industry in the whole UK got nationalised into BSC, British Steel Corporation. And in '79, the first year that Thatcher was PM, British Steel, as it then was, consolidated all the steel making in the UK into a few sites to try to cut costs. South Wales is one, Sheffield, Teesside, and the Corby site was closed that very same year. Now, 50,000 people was big for Corby, for this little village, but it's not a big diversified city. It was a monotown, right? Steel was the only employer. So things got pretty bad, right? There was high crime, high unemployment. I heard when I was there that we had the highest rate of adults with no teeth in all of Europe, which is apparently like a serious measure used by academics because it's easy to collect, but it correlates with a bunch of other like more hidden quality of life metrics. Because how do you lose your teeth, right? Like bad health or a fight or meth. So like it works. I couldn't verify any of that, but I did find some proper statistics on sort of highest rates of antisocial behaviour in the UK, sort of nighttime curfews on all teenagers, which I do remember coming in just after I'd left. This was the Safeway at the end of the street that got burnt down. The size of that Greggs though, we're not complete heathens. But one of the high schools went up to people set fire to things for fun. I moved there in 1988. I sound English because I was speaking before we moved there, but I was there from age 3 to 18. So I don't actually have any Scottish heritage. Sorry to disappoint the people that put me on this stage. But I sort of almost kind of grew up somewhere near here that was 200 miles away. And I do have friends with families, Scottish family connections. And when you stay in touch with them, you get to be their groomsmen, you get to wear Highland wear, which is great fun. There's a video of me trying to Kaylee, which is not on here. So, why am I chatting about this shit? I then left, as you would. I went to York Uni, and then I got my first job, and I was doing embedded C, the kind of stuff that I thought was cool back then. And it was an interesting place to work. Everything we did was correct, like very, very correct. Every line was agonized over in terms of the semantics of the C programming language, the sequence points and all that stuff. Even the machine code, it would admit. And there were a lot of grumpy greybeards around whose favorite phrase was, "No, you can't." And things moved very, very slowly. But we did try to go a bit faster. We did build some tooling, right? C is like Go. For all the kids in the room, C is like Go. It has no features. You have to write everything yourself. And I mean, like, you want a linked list, you want to dict a map, you have to write it yourself. So, like how most of Kubernetes is actually auto-generated, we auto-generated it. We had XSLT that turned XML into more XML, and then we had Python that turned that into C. Somebody shook their head. XSLT is my second favorite functional programming language. It's almost as good as Excel. It's, so yes, it was clunky as fuck, but YAML and JSONet and Q and the beloved Rust didn't exist. And they had done automation, they had tried. But then I went through, I think they call it a phase, and I did some Windows desktop development. And I know it's easy to shoot fish in a barrel with this stuff, like the bugs in Microsoft and the documentation that reads like marketing. But my real problem was that the mindset wasn't there. There was no CI in this company. There were no build machines, right? To compile the product, which you did on your dev machine, you had to install a bunch of random dependencies, which you clicked to do. And I know package management on Windows sucks, but no one had tried. No one had tried to make it standard. No one had tried to make it repeatable. And I, at that point in my career, didn't have the language for hermetic builds or supply chain provenance or the capability maturity model. But the vibes fell off, you know? So then I ended up at Cisco, not at Isovalent, didn't do routing and switching, but I was hired as a software engineer. And we were writing some software and we needed some test infrastructure, some compute and some networks. And there was this OpenStack cluster in the corner, and people were clicking around its UI to make VMs and virtual networks. Now we're up to 2013 by this point, which was simultaneously forever ago. But also they should have known better. Actually, if anybody's not used OpenStack, then my picture for this slide was going to be somebody vomiting into a bin. But I know it's before lunch. Every time Cube breaks, you don't know how good you've got it. But because I was the new boy, everybody was making me going to do their clicking. But this thing had an API, so I started curling it. And then I put my curl commands into bash scripts. And then I parameterized my bash scripts by making them read environment files. So I ended up with this structured file describing my environment and code that would ingest it and manage infrastructure based on it. I really don't want to overplay the features and the quality of this bash script, but the idea maybe isn't a million miles from Terraform, right? And it seemed the most magical thing in the world to me. It seemed the obvious thing to do because I was bored and things were moving slowly and I was making mistakes. So I'm not claiming to have invented DevOps, right? Actually, don't owe me any royalties. But tooling was undeniably a massive part of the revolution that happened in whatever it was, 2013, 2015 in infrastructure. C groups and namespaces already existed and people were using them, but Docker made it easy. And it solved practical problems like image storage. It just took them out of the way so people could get on with their actual job, right? That they added the value to that service of image storage, which is really boring, but actually really hard to set up yourself, properly. And as Liz says, they standardized it. And the mindset shift was also very important. I don't think we'd be here without people putting money into building this early tooling before they knew there was necessarily a market for it. Because OpenStack allegedly supported containers, Mesos Marathon, early ECS. If anybody had the misfortune to use any of this stuff, I don't know if anybody ever got Docker Swarm working properly. But then Kubernetes came along, and the rest is history. And we had tooling, and the tooling was good. Yes, the tooling. So you can see in the bottom right where it became self-aware. And this banner at the top that says overwhelmed, ? That's like a code comment that says, here be dragons. So they literally automated this. Fun story, talk about meta. Dan Kohn used to maintain this manually, apparently, this HTML page. And there's this blog from Netlify, you can go find it, boasting about how they re-platformed this over to Netlify so that Dan could have a staging site where he could preview his changes. They added CI/CD to the list of CI/CD tools. It is so DevOps. It's like putting a Prometheus endpoint on your cat. But it is the right mindset. And those were chaotic days. I do look back on them fondly. They were fun. They were exciting. I wrote a talk one afternoon about how Istio works, and it flew me to 4 continents. It's where my career took off. It was great. But I mostly worked for consultancies, or worse, for vendors. And I didn't have to care about these platforms after 5 p.m. on a Friday. And running platforms back then was seat of the pants stuff, right? It was all very new. It was very exciting. By the time you got something working and deployed, it was out of date. I remember helping one customer late on a Friday night rotate all of the certs in their Kube cluster because they were about to expire and take the whole thing down, and they'd never automated or even planned for certificate rotation because the certs had an expiry of a year, and none of their clusters has ever lived that long before. They'd just gone obsolete before they'd ever got to that point. And suddenly we had this thing that worked and needed to be maintained because it was serving their customers. But I think this whole hype cycle kind of grew a bit too fast. Reality didn't really keep up. You remember when we had job postings for DevOps engineer, and what is that? I want a friendly engineer, Any skills, any experience? No, just kind of know everything and, you know, be really friendly. So, you know, and I think people didn't know what that role was. You know, even if you could hire an DevOps, like, is that a dev who does ops? Because I'm a dev who likes infrastructure as a problem space, but I hate ops, right? Ops is boring. That's why I'm a dev. Dev is creative. Dev is varied. Or is it an ops person who can write the odd script? Because I think, sadly, that's what a lot of us did end up hiring because there was just a complete scarcity of skills back then. And a lot of these so-called DevOps engineers, they didn't have the background, the domain knowledge, that understanding of one level below the abstraction you're working with, which is, you know, something I always hire for, to like effectively troubleshoot when things go wrong. And they didn't have that software engineering mindset of abstracting and factoring things out, like proper abstractions. Indirection is not abstraction. Adding another layer is not helping anybody. So maybe we do have these slightly rose-tinted goggles for when everything was new and moving fast. You know, remember when it was worth reading the Kubernetes release notes because there was actually changes every version. I've got this friend who's a theatre director, doesn't understand tech at all, and said, "You work in tech. I thought you'd have an Android so you can like reprogram it." And I just looked at him and I said, "I spend all my day with broken machines. I have an iPhone and a Toyota because when I get home, I want things to work." That doesn't mean it can't be a high-performance machine. It just means finding the right balance, I think, for the circumstances, knowing what appropriate quality is, remembering that we're software engineers with an emphasis on engineer. And why are we engineering software? To make the site more reliable. It's in the name. So I think we're in a better place now. With the platform engineering movement, you know, this feels much more mature. And like Liz was saying, there's now a bunch of de facto standards that have emerged, so you don't have to get lost in the landscape anymore. Things don't change all the time, and we're now, you know, people are bringing the product mindset, the professional mindset, building things not because we can, but because they're what customers will value. I remember so much CV-driven development, so much conference talk-driven development. So here's the very stretched analogy. Corby's in a much better place too. There's been investment in the right places. There's been a mindset shift. All right, there's a big transport hub now there giving a lot of jobs. There's a lot of high-tech manufacturing. They even built a shiny theater. Obviously, nothing's perfect. Sadly, flag shagging was in full force when I went back down, but everybody makes mistakes, right? Not everybody's getting it right all the time. So what did I want to leave you with? I think our industry was in a steady state. We were good at building stable, repeatable systems. That, like greybeard Unix admins had immense knowledge and they took great care. And even if they didn't have very long levers to pull to help them work effectively, you know, they delivered good value at the time. And Corby, likewise, was humming along. There weren't massive opportunities if you didn't want to work in the steelworks, but there was near total employment. And then, not to diminish the experience of anybody who had to live through it, I had to live through it. You know, Corby had a low point, and I would argue maybe that DevOps was a low point as well, looking back. But I think through hard work and reflection, we're now both back at a steady state and at a better one. And Glasgow's a great place now. You should go visit. So my question for you this conference, because I have to do this, is AI, undeniably a big disruptor, undeniably a hype cycle. Things are going to get excited again, like if I give an agentic intelligence write access to prod, those certs are going to expire, it's going to get spicy. So how do we make sure that it's a high point this time and not a dip? Thanks.